Celia lay curled on the cold metal floor, her sleek fur matted with filth and streaked with dried blood from the rough treatment she had endured. The air in the cargo hold was thick with the stench of oil, sweat, and old decay, a putrid mix that clung to the walls like an unwanted guest. Dim emergency lights flickered along the ceiling, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with each passing moment. The distant hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the deck, a low and constant reminder that she was trapped deep in the belly of a slaver's vessel, far from any hope of rescue. Her ears twitched at the slightest sound, always alert, always listening. The soft whimper of her kittens was the only thing keeping her tethered to the present, preventing the creeping despair from consuming her entirely. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to tug against the thick metal chain fastened around her neck. The cuff was crude but effective, bolted tightly to a support beam in the farthest corner of the hold. It allowed just enough movement for her to reach the shallow dish of water the slavers had provided, barely enough to keep her alive. The food, if it could even be called that, was a tasteless paste thrown into a dented tin bowl, meant more for sustenance than nourishment. Her kittens, 3 tiny bundles of fur barely a week old, nestled against her belly, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. They had not yet opened their eyes, but she could feel their warmth, the fragile life pulsing within them. She licked them gently, her tongue rasping over their soft coats in a soothing rhythm, though her heart ached with the knowledge that she could not protect them from what was coming. The slavers had taken great interest in them. Rare specimens, they had called them. Valuable. If not for the fact that she was nursing, she suspected they would have already been ripped from her grasp and sold separately to the highest bidder. A sudden clang echoed through the cargo hold as the heavy metal door groaned open. The harsh light from the corridor spilled inside, forcing her to narrow her pupils against the glare. 2 figures stepped in, their armored boots clanking against the grated floor. The first was a towering brute of a creature, his thick hide a mottled gray-green, with deep ridges running along his skull. His beady black eyes scanned the room with lazy indifference, as if everything before him was beneath his concern. The second figure was smaller, leaner, but no less menacing, a humanoid with pale, almost translucent skin, his elongated fingers tapping absently against the hilt of a shock baton at his waist. "Still alive, are you?" the smaller one sneered, stepping closer. His voice was cold, laced with mock amusement. He crouched down, just out of reach, peering at the kittens. "You should be grateful we're letting you keep them for now. It's a kindness most don't get." Celia flattened her ears against her skull, her tail curling protectively around her young. A low, warning growl rumbled in her throat, though she knew it was pointless. They had already proven they held the power. The bruises along her ribs, the deep cut along her shoulder, these were reminders of what happened when she fought back. The brute beside him let out a gruff chuckle. "Feisty little thing, isn't she? Maybe we should break her spirit a bit before the sale. No one wants a pet with claws." The smaller one smirked, tilting his head. "Tempting, but we've already got a buyer lined up. High-paying, too. Apparently they have a thing for exotic mothers." His words sent a shudder through her. She had heard the whispers, the grim fates that awaited those who were sold into servitude. Some were sent to fight in brutal blood pits for the amusement of the wealthy. Others were forced into entertainment, their bodies no longer their own. And then there were those taken as living trophies, pampered in gilded cages, but never truly free. He reached out suddenly, gripping her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look at him. His nails dug into her fur, pressing against the delicate skin beneath. "Behave yourself, and maybe you'll get a decent master. Maybe your kittens will grow up somewhere safe instead of getting butchered for their pelts." Who knows? Her muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at her to bite, to scratch, to tear him apart. But she didn't. Not yet. She forced herself to remain still, to let him believe he had won. Her time would come. It had to. Satisfied, he released her, wiping his fingers against his trousers as if touching her had somehow soiled him. "We leave port in 3 days. You better pray to whatever gods you have that your buyer doesn't change their mind." With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door, the brute following close behind. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, the metallic clang echoing through the empty hold. Celia exhaled slowly, her breath shaking. 3 days. That was all the time she had left. She lowered her head, nuzzling her kittens, drawing what little comfort she could from their tiny bodies pressed against hers. She had survived this long. Somehow she would find a way to survive this, too. Riker adjusted the hood of his worn-out cloak as he stepped into the dimly lit corridor of the slaver ship. The scent of sweat, oil, and something fouler clung to the air, mixing into the usual stench that accompanied vessels trafficking in lives. He had been on ships like this before, too many times to count, but each time it made his stomach churn. He moved with practiced ease, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering light strips that barely illuminated the walkway. To anyone watching, he was just another buyer, another unscrupulous trader looking for the best deal on sentient flesh. The guard stationed at the entrance barely looked up as Riker passed, his thick fingers lazily scrolling through a datapad. He was the type to let people roam where they pleased so long as no alarms went off and no fights broke out. Riker took advantage of it, moving further inside, past rows of locked cages and containment cells, each holding someone who had been stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and often their will to resist. He hated slavers, hated them with a passion that ran deep, but he knew better than to let it show. Anger wouldn't free anyone. Not today, at least. His boots made no sound as he stepped down the grated floor, his eyes sweeping over the prisoners. Some sat huddled, barely acknowledging his presence. Others watched with dull, hopeless eyes past the point of caring who came or went. A few still held on to a spark of defiance, their gazes hard as they followed his movements. Those were the ones that wouldn't last long. Slavers had a way of breaking spirits, and the ones who refused to submit were usually the first to disappear. He wasn't here for them. Not yet. Riker turned a corner and reached a sealed storage unit at the end of the corridor. His information was solid. His contact had sworn that the most valuable specimen on the ship had been kept separately. He tapped a small device at his wrist, activating the hidden scanner embedded in his sleeve. The door was locked with a low-grade security code, the kind used to deter low-level intruders, but nothing more advanced. A few quick keystrokes later, the panel blinked green, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The air inside was colder, the atmosphere heavy with something unspoken. He stepped forward, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. His gaze landed on the chained figure in the corner, and he immediately understood why this one had been separated from the rest. She was curled around something, her back pressed against the cold metal wall, her tail wrapped protectively around a small bundle of fur. Kittens. Riker felt a sharp pang in his chest at the sight. Her ears twitched at his presence, but she didn't move, didn't react beyond the subtle tensing of her shoulders. Her fur was sleek but unkempt, a sign of someone too exhausted to groom properly. A fresh cut ran along her shoulder, still raw and barely scabbed over. The thick metal collar around her neck was attached to a heavy chain bolted into the floor, restricting her movement. She looked up then, her feline eyes locking onto his. There was no plea for help in her expression, no desperation, just wary calculation, the look of someone who had long since accepted her fate, but wasn't going to make it easy for anyone who tried to take what was hers. Riker crouched slowly, keeping his hands where she could see them. He knew better than to make sudden movements around someone who had been treated like an animal. "You look like hell," he murmured, keeping his voice low. She didn't respond, only watching him, waiting. Riker let his eyes flicker to the kittens, barely a week old by the looks of them. They were pressed close to their mother, tiny and fragile, their fur a soft mix of dark and light patterns. His jaw clenched slightly. He had known she was valuable, had known the slavers were keeping her for a high-paying buyer. But seeing her like this, with her young, vulnerable and helpless, it made his decision for him. He wasn't going to let her stay here. "Easy," he said, shifting just slightly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Still, she remained silent, her muscles taut, her gaze unwavering. He respected that. Riker reached into his coat, pulling out a small data drive and holding it up between two fingers. "I came here as a buyer. That's what the slavers think. But that's not why I'm here." Her ears twitched, the first sign that she was listening. "I'm getting you out of here," he continued. "You and them," he nodded toward the kittens. "But I need to know, can you walk?" For the first time, she moved. Not much, just a slow, deliberate shift as she tested the chain's limits. The metal links rattled slightly, the sound loud in the quiet of the room. Her tail flicked once, a sign of irritation or thoughtfulness. He wasn't sure which. Riker set the data drive on the ground between them, a show of trust. I can't break that chain here, not without drawing attention. But I can come back. Tonight. He met her gaze again. If you want out, be ready. Still, she said nothing. Riker pushed himself to his feet, adjusting his cloak. I'll be back, he promised. Don't lose hope just yet. He turned and slipped back out of the room, sealing the door behind him. His heart pounded slightly as he made his way back down the corridor, forcing himself to look as disinterested as before. This wasn't going to be easy, but then again, nothing worth doing ever was. Riker moved through the corridors of the slaver ship with the ease of someone who had walked through places like this 100 times before. His footsteps were measured, his expression unreadable beneath the dim overhead lights. He had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, knowing exactly how to carry himself to avoid suspicion. Slavers were a predictable breed, too arrogant to imagine someone could be working against them right under their noses. That arrogance was the only reason he was still alive. The ship's interior was a maze of rusted bulkheads and grated walkways, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and engine fumes. He passed by another set of cages, keeping his gaze forward, ignoring the pleading eyes that followed him. He had to stay focused. He could only save one life tonight, 4 if he counted the kittens, and he had no room for distractions. As he approached the security station, he slowed his pace. A single guard sat slumped in a chair, his feet propped up on the control panel, scrolling through a datapad with the dull expression of someone barely paying attention. His blaster lay on the console beside him within easy reach, but the man was too absorbed in whatever he was watching to notice Riker standing there. Riker pulled a small device from his coat, a sleek black cylinder no bigger than his thumb. He pressed the activation switch, and a faint pulse of energy rippled through the air, disrupting the ship's internal surveillance system. The guard barely reacted, only frowning slightly at his screen as the feed momentarily flickered. "System's buggy again," the guard muttered to himself. Riker stepped forward, his movement as smooth as a shadow. Before the guard could react, Riker grabbed him by the collar and slammed his head against the console with a dull thud. The man let out a choked gasp before slumping forward, unconscious. Riker caught him before he could fall, lowering him carefully to the floor. He stripped the guard of his access badge and pocketed it, then quickly scanned the panel. The security feed was still frozen, giving him a small window of time. He tapped through the interface, locating the lock override for the cargo hold. The control screen flashed red. A high-level security clearance was needed to deactivate the restraints. "Figures," Riker muttered. He would have to do this the hard way. Leaving the guard slumped against the console, he slipped back into the corridor, moving with renewed urgency. The slavers would make their final preparations soon. If he didn't act now, he would lose his chance. The door to the storage unit where she was held loomed ahead, its reinforced frame a stark reminder that she was considered valuable property. Riker swiped the stolen access badge and the lock disengaged with a soft beep. The door slid open, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. She was exactly where he had left her, curled around her kittens, her eyes snapping to him the moment he entered. There was no fear in her gaze, only wary expectation. Riker crouched beside her, keeping his voice low. "It's time. Can you stand?" She shifted slightly, testing the limits of her restraints. The heavy chain clinked against the floor as she pulled against it, her ears twitching in irritation. Riker pulled a small cutting tool from his belt, activating the plasma filament with a quiet hum. He worked quickly, pressing the blade against the thick metal links. Sparks danced through the air as the heat began to eat through the restraint. "Almost there," he murmured. She remained still, watching him with an intensity that made it clear she understood the gravity of this moment. Her kittens stirred slightly, their tiny bodies shifting against her warmth, oblivious to the danger around them. The final link gave way with a sharp snap, and the chain fell to the floor. She exhaled softly, rubbing at the raw skin beneath the collar. "We need to move," Riker said, standing. "Now." She rose to her feet, adjusting the way she held her young, securing them against her with the natural folds of her fur. Riker had seen plenty of species with different ways of carrying their offspring, but he had never seen anything quite like this. It was efficient, almost seamless, as if nature itself had designed her to protect them in the worst of circumstances. He motioned for her to follow and stepped back into the corridor, scanning for movement. The ship remained quiet, but he knew that wouldn't last. He led her down a side passage, avoiding the main walkways. taking a route that would keep them out of sight. As they neared the docking bay, his earpiece crackled with a sudden burst of static. "Riker, you've got company," a voice warned. It was Luthan, his pilot, monitoring from their getaway ship. "Security's waking up. You need to move." "Copy that," Riker muttered. He glanced back at her. She kept pace, her steps light despite the burden she carried. The docking bay was just ahead, the doors sealed but easily bypassed with the stolen access badge. He swiped it and the panel turned green. As the doors slid open, an alarm blared. Riker cursed under his breath. "They're on to us." She tensed, but didn't hesitate. "Stay close," he ordered, drawing his blaster. The docking bay was a massive open space filled with cargo crates, fuel canisters, and several small ships awaiting transport. His own vessel, a sleek, modified freighter, was parked near the edge, its boarding ramp already lowered. Shouts echoed behind them, guards closing in. Riker turned and fired, dropping the first before he could raise his weapon. The second managed to get a shot off, the blast narrowly missing Riker as he ducked behind a crate. "Go!" he shouted over his shoulder. She sprinted for the ship, her movements fluid despite the added weight of her young. Riker covered her, his shots precise, forcing the remaining guards to take cover. As soon as she reached the ramp, she turned, her fur bristling as she bared her fangs at their pursuers. Riker dashed toward the freighter, dodging another barrage of blaster fire. A shot grazed his shoulder, searing pain ripping through his nerves, but he didn't. The moment he reached the ramp, he slammed his fist against the control panel, retracting it. The ship's engines roared to life, and the docking bay doors slammed shut behind them. He stumbled into the cockpit, his breath ragged. "Luthan, get us out of here," he ordered. The pilot didn't hesitate. The ship shuddered as it lifted off, thrusters burning bright. Riker turned, his gaze meeting hers. They were free. But the fight wasn't over yet. The ship jolted as it broke free from the slaver vessel's docking bay, the inertial dampeners straining against the sudden burst of acceleration. Riker barely had time to catch his breath before another impact rocked the hull. The slavers were already firing at them. "Luthan's status?" Riker barked, pushing himself into the co-pilot seat. "Shields are holding, but not for long," Luthan replied, his hands flying over the control panel. His voice was calm, but the tightness in his jaw told a different story. "They've launched pursuit drones. Fast little bastards," Riker cursed under his breath. He knew the slavers wouldn't let them go without a fight, but he had hoped for a little more distance before things got messy. He tapped a sequence into the weapons console, bringing the ship's automated turrets online. "Keep us moving. I'll handle them." He turned his head slightly, glancing toward her. She was crouched in the corner of the cockpit, her kittens still pressed against her body, their small forms hidden beneath the protective folds of her fur. Her eyes flicked between the flashing lights on the console and the distant figures of the enemy ships outside the viewport. She said nothing, but the tension in her shoulders was unmistakable. The first drone swept into range, its sleek form barely visible against the void of space. Riker squeezed the trigger, and a burst of plasma fire ripped through the darkness. The drone exploded in a silent flash, sending debris scattering in all directions. "One down," he muttered. Luthan banked hard to the left, narrowly avoiding another incoming blast. The ship groaned in protest, metal straining against the violent maneuver. "Two more incoming," Luthan warned. Riker tracked the targets, his fingers tightening around the controls. His muscles burned from the tension, but he ignored it. He fired again, clipping the second drone's wing. It spiraled out of control, crashing into the slaver ship behind it. The third, however, was still closing in. She shifted slightly, her claws flexing against the floor. She wasn't a soldier, Riker could tell that much, but she had the instincts of a survivor. She was watching, calculating, trying to understand the chaos unfolding around her. He adjusted his aim, waiting for the right moment. The drone banked sharply, preparing to fire. Riker pulled the trigger. A direct hit. The explosion sent a ripple through the cockpit's reinforced glass, momentarily illuminating her face in the glow of destruction. She blinked but remained still, her expression unreadable. "That's the last of the drones," Luthan reported, "but we've got bigger problems. The slaver ship is preparing a long-range strike. We won't outrun it in a straight line." Riker exhaled sharply. "Then we don't give them a straight line." He turned toward the navigation console, his eyes scanning the surrounding star systems. There was only one real option, an asteroid belt just beyond the nearby gas giant. It was a risky maneuver, but better than getting blasted out of the sky. "Luthan, take us into the belt." The pilot hesitated. "That's suicide." "Not if we time it right," Riker said. "They won't follow us in. Not at full speed, anyway. Luthan gritted his teeth but adjusted their course. The ship's engines roared as they veered toward the dense field of tumbling rocks. The slaver vessel loomed behind them, its massive cannons glowing with deadly intent. "Brace," Luthan muttered. The ship plunged into the asteroid field, weaving between massive hunks of space debris. Each rock was a potential death sentence, some large enough to crush them instantly, others small but traveling at lethal speeds. The alarms blared, warning of incoming collisions. She tightened her hold on her kittens, her ears flattened against her skull. The ship shuddered violently as a stray asteroid clipped their wing, sending sparks flying through the cockpit. "Shields at 30%, Luthen shouted. "Just keep flying," Riker said through gritted teeth. Behind them, the slaver ship hesitated. The larger vessel couldn't match their maneuverability, and its weapons were useless in such unpredictable terrain. It slowed, recalibrating, trying to find a way to flush them out. Riker saw the opening. "Luthen, cut thrusters on my mark. Trust me." The ship twisted between two massive asteroids, and Riker counted down in his head. "No." Luthen slammed the controls, and the ship suddenly lost momentum, dropping into a free fall between the tumbling rocks. The slaver vessel, expecting them to keep moving, fired a barrage of plasma rounds directly into the asteroid field. The energy blasts struck the surrounding debris, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. Trucks of rocks slammed into the slaver ship's shields, each impact weakening its defenses. Riker watched as one particularly massive asteroid, dislodged by the explosion, drifted straight into the enemy vessel's hull. The impact was devastating. The slaver ship's midsection crumpled under the force, fire and debris spilling into the void. Within seconds, secondary explosions erupted along its length. The vessel listed to one side, its engines sputtering out. Riker exhaled, allowing himself a small smirk. "Well," Lathan said, breathing heavily, "that worked." Riker turned to her. "We're clear." She blinked, her gaze shifting between him and the wreckage outside the viewport. Then, slowly, she relaxed. It wasn't much, just a slight easing of her shoulders, a flicker of relief in her eyes. But it was enough. She was safe. For now. Riker leaned back in his seat, his hands still gripping the console as the wreckage of the slaver ship drifted further into the asteroid field. The tension in his shoulders hadn't eased, even though the immediate danger was over. He knew better than to relax too soon. Surviving one battle didn't mean the war was won. The slavers would have sent out a distress signal before they lost control. Someone would come looking, and if he didn't get them far away from this sector, they would be running again before long. Luthan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "We should change course. If they had allies nearby, we don't want to be here when they arrive." His fingers hovered over the nav controls, waiting for Riker's response. Riker nodded, but before he could speak, his eyes drifted toward her. She remained in the corner of the cockpit, her body curled protectively around her kittens. She had not spoken since they escaped, not even when the battle had raged outside. He understood why. For someone who had spent so long in chains, freedom didn't immediately feel real. She was still waiting for the moment it would be taken away again. He knew that feeling all too well. "We head to the fringe colonies," Riker said finally. "There's a station on the outskirts of the Kessari Nebula. It's a safe place to regroup, and it's far enough from the slavers' usual hunting grounds." Luthan tapped in the coordinates without argument. 3 jumps to get there. "I'll set us on course." As the ship powered up its hyperdrive, Riker turned his attention fully to her. He crouched down, careful to keep his movements slow. Her eyes flickered to him, wary but not hostile. Her tail curled slightly, her body tense but no longer trembling with exhaustion. "You're safe now," Riker said, his voice calm, steady. "No more chains, no more cages." She studied him for a long moment before she spoke. Her voice was quiet, rough from disuse. "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. He nodded. "Yeah." She glanced down at her kittens, adjusting the way they nestled against her. They had slept through the battle, oblivious to how close they had come to losing everything. She ran a gentle paw over their fur, her touch softer than Riker had expected from someone who had fought so hard to survive. She looked back at him. "Why?" Riker leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Why what? Why did you help?" He exhaled through his nose, considering his answer. There were 100 things he could say. Because he hated slavers, because he had seen too many people suffer, because he had spent his life trying to make up for the things he had done before he cared enough to stop being part of the problem. But instead, he just said, "Because I could." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod. It wasn't gratitude, not yet, but it was something. The ship lurched as the hyperdrive engaged, stars stretching into streaks of light before settling into the deep stillness of hyperspace. Luthen turned in his seat. "First jump complete. We've got a few hours before the next one." His eyes flickered toward her, then back to Riker. "What's the plan after we reach Kasari?" Riker knew what he was asking. He had gotten her off the slaver ship, but that didn't mean the fight was over. She had nowhere to go, and if she was left alone now, she wouldn't last long. "We find her a place," Riker said. Luthen raised an eyebrow. "A place where?" Riker looked at her again. "That's up to her." She blinked, clearly surprised by the idea that she had a choice. Riker realized that she had probably never been given one before. "You don't have to decide now," he said, "but when we get to Kesari, you'll have options." She was silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I want to be free." Riker smiled, just a little. "Then that's what you'll be." She lowered her head, brushing her nose against one of her kittens. It was the first truly peaceful moment he had seen from her. She was still on edge, still healing, but for the first time since he had found her in that cell, she wasn't bracing for the worst. The ship hummed softly around them, carrying them further away from the past. For the first time in a long time, Riker didn't feel like he was running toward another fight. He was just moving forward, and for now, that was enough.